welcome to Masters of TESOL. This episode is a companion piece to episode 4 with Jennifer Jenkins about English as a lingua franca, so you might want to go back and check out that episode first. If you're not bothered, then feel free to press on and listen to Martin Dewey, who's a senior lecturer at King's College London and has researched language and globalisation and English as a lingua franca. And we're going to be looking at the classroom implications. If you have already listened to episode 4, then you're probably aware that ELF is a slippery customer at best.
It's a very difficult subject to talk about because it is very challenging. I know that, I understand that from a teacher's point of view, it is frustrating when we say all these things about language from an ELF perspective. We talk about ELF research. Teachers then go away confused, concerned. There are no easy answers.
ELF is not a methodology, it's not an approach, as I was very quickly told in the interview. But I think there, at its core, no pun intended, but at its core there is a important and useful perspective for dealing with classes, especially that we are now teaching in this globalized world. I spoke with Jennifer Jenkins just a couple of weeks ago about English as a lingua franca. But if you could just explain in very basic terms for any new listeners, what is English as a lingua franca?
English as a lingua franca is any use of English in which the language is functioning as a contact language. Yeah? So that it is spoken between speakers of different first language backgrounds. So, for example, it's the typical English setting you get at an international conference, for example, where you have delegates from many different backgrounds, from many different first languages, communicating together in English.
We're speaking today specifically about the pedagogical approach.
Not so much approach. I wouldn't use the word approach because that suggests that there is a single set of methods that are associated with English as a lingua franca. So it's more about an orientation or perspective. And I think that would be a much more representative way of thinking about the implications of research in English as a lingua franca for language pedagogy.
Okay, does that make that very difficult for some teachers to accept that it isn't a methodology as such?
It does, yes. I think it's very difficult to think of ELF, I'll be referring to it as ELF, right? So I think it's very difficult for teachers to understand what ELF means in relation to language pedagogy, because as teachers we are used to having a very definitive set of language forms and then presenting them in the classroom in a very particular way. So teachers are used to dealing with sets of resources that are very clearly demarcated. Yep. So this is the English that you're going to teach. And similarly with methods, we are used to thinking about a particular approach. So you do English teaching in this way or in that way. And I think with ELF, it raises lots of implications for how we think about language in the classroom, how much attention we focus on what are considered correct English language forms in the conventional sense of the word. And typically how we orient to language in what I describe as a normative way. So we're very used to thinking about language as having a correct form and an incorrect form. And language teaching materials are still very much attached to that notion of language, even though English is a particularly diverse language.
I'm sure a lot of teachers listening are thinking, well, if there is no standardized form, then what do I teach?
Yes. That's a question that we're still trying to understand how best to answer that question. Yeah. So I think when this area of research first started to take off, we tended to think about it as trying to find an alternative set of norms. So thinking about codifying English as a lingua franca and then perhaps standardizing it. And I think that was probably the wrong way to approach this. I think it's more a question of not looking at alternative norms or alternative standards, but moving away from our attachment to standardization. Yeah? Because if we look at data taken from interactions among speakers in an English as a lingua franca setting, what you find is people are very often quite flexible in the way they use language forms and can very often be quite creative with their use of language forms. So, for example, instead of using an established word form, they might use a noun suffix in a creative way and say a word like curiousness instead of curiosity. Now that's perfectly communicative, right? That conveys meaning just as effectively as the word curiosity. In fact, it might convey the meaning better than the word curiosity because the noun suffix, the ness suffix, if you like, is a more archetypal noun suffix. So it's not so much about teaching teachers and students that they should be using words like curiousness, but it's about showing them how knowing the morphology of the language, knowing that ness is a noun suffix, and that using it with words, if you are unsure of what the established noun is, can be communicatively very effective. So it's about seeing the language more as a set of resources. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So, from a classroom perspective, how does a teacher go about using this? And again, I'm dancing around the word approach, but using this idea, let's say, ideology.
Adopting this perspective. Maybe we could say that instead of using this
Okay, yeah,
approach.
perspective. Yeah.
So I think first and foremost, it means looking at materials, looking at established teaching materials, the textbooks that teachers are being asked to use, and passing a critical eye over them, rethinking whether or not we need to pay so much attention, for example, to distinguishing between two forms that don't very much matter in terms of communication. So if you look at a typical course book for say an early intermediate level, there will be lots of practice activities asking students to identify and then rehearse the difference between, say, there is and there are, or I can think of any other, or using, for example, third person forms of the verb, and spending a huge amount of time on this. So I think it's a question of teachers looking at those kinds of activities and then determining whether or not they are useful for their students. Obviously, many teachers are restricted in what they can do because students will be studying a particular course, possibly for a particular exam. So another implication of ELF research is perhaps that we should rethink the way we understand language competence and proficiency. I'm not necessarily making a particular distinction between competence and proficiency. So rethink the way we understand competence and or proficiency, and then rethink the way we assess language. Obviously, it's very, very difficult for individual teachers to do this because they might be told, right, your students have to sit the IELTS exam, you've got to prepare them for the IELTS exam. So there is a lot of exam preparation that influences what we teach and how we teach it. That's partly quite problematic, I think, in terms of adopting an ELF perspective in the classroom. But there is a lot that teachers can do to assess the usefulness of language practice activities and materials. What I think we could do is incorporate in language teaching materials more non-native speakers of English, so get their voice heard more in the texts, so that students and teachers are exposed to a greater variety of English language forms. So typically textbooks will have native English speakers as the model, the primary language model, or exclusive language model. So either British English or American English predominantly. Sometimes, yes, you'll get speakers who are from Australia or New Zealand or South Africa. Occasionally, you will find textbook materials where there are non-native speakers of English who are being in the tape scripts, for example. But typically, they are not presented as examples of good English language use and communication. So what I think we could do is incorporate more examples taken from corpus studies, The Jennifer Jenkins in her podcast mentioned the voice corpus, the
Yes.
Vienna Oxford International Corpus of English, right, based at the University of Vienna. Now, this is readily accessible. This is anybody can access this and look at data in the voice corpus. I think if teachers, and this really begins with teacher education during teacher training programs, if we were able to spend longer looking at this kind of interaction, showing teachers how speakers in English actually communicate, especially in a lingua franca setting, then that would give them a much better idea of how to focus on language in the classroom in a way that is much more useful for the students in terms of how they communicate meaning and understand meaning. Yeah, so and that would mean looking more at the strategies we use when we communicate rather than the linguistic forms themselves. So instead of focusing on which verb forms, which tense forms, and so on, it would be a question of looking at how speakers will use their resources, how they interact with each other, how they respond to each other's turns in conversation, how they signal understanding and non-understanding, for example, how they accommodate to each other, how, for example, they might adapt the way they are speaking in order to make their speech more intelligible to their interlocutors.
So you mentioned having to teach to a test, or
Yeah.
what are the limitations are there to the ELF perspective?
Well, the limitations are that the tests are often very high stakes. And so a lot of teaching is devoted to preparing students for these tests. I mean, students are taking English language tests all over the world in order to be accepted for a place at university, for example.
Mhm.
So until we can change the people writing the exams, the language tests, then we need to bear in mind that adopting an ELF perspective has to be something that is done alongside more conventional approaches, not in place of. Yeah. So it's something that can supplement what language teachers do until eventually we do manage to change language testers. Now, there are some developments in English language testing where people are looking at how we might determine language proficiency differently and how we might therefore assess it differently. But in the meantime, yes, the language tests do represent quite a restriction on how much a teacher can adopt an ELF perspective in the classroom.
What have you found has been the teacher's response to the ELF perspective?
I've done quite a lot of research into this. My main interest is looking at how teachers respond to ELF when they are when we talk about it, when they are shown ELF data, and how willing and able they feel they are in terms of adopting this perspective in practice. So I've been very interested in researching the implications for practice among language teachers. What I've tended to find is that a lot of teachers will be very open to the idea of ELF research. They're very interested by it. It tends to generate a lot of discussion during classroom time. This is usually on an MA per master's program. And so I teach on master's programs to experienced language teachers, and ELF and global English is more broadly is one of the key topics that we discuss. And teachers tend to be at the beginning possibly a little bit resistant to the idea. It's a very new way of thinking about English and thinking about language teaching. But then very often they report that they find this very interesting and then they think it has a lot of implications for their current practice. But then at the same time, they will express concerns about how they adopt this perspective and to what extent they can adopt this perspective given current constraints that they experience. Given that they have very often have a prescribed textbook, and given that they very often have to prepare for a particular exam, and that students and parents especially will be interested in knowing how much progress there is being made in relation to preparing for a particular exam or in relation to being able to produce standardized English.
That is the kind of the difficulty. Maybe there's interest in ELF,
There's a
but
lot of interest, yeah.
yeah, but
Yeah.
it's that idea that it's kind of going against the grain of a lot of curriculums.
Yeah, it is going against the grain. But then what's important here is developing a critical awareness among teachers that the established curriculum might not be the most beneficial curriculum for teachers and students to follow. So it's about developing that critical awareness and then enabling teachers to think of ways in which they might adapt existing resources in order to open the curriculum up a little bit more to varieties of English and to English as a lingua franca.
I heard one story of this is from a professor of mine that he was in a teachers' conference in Singapore, I think, and there was
Mm-hmm.
one teacher who was questioning ELF as an approach and basically ripped up his membership card, stormed out saying, "What am I supposed to teach?"
That's not unheard of. Yeah. I mean, when I first started presenting on ELF, I would give talks about this, and people would stand up. Not many, but one or two. I've had one or two experiences where people stood up and walked out of the room while I was presenting. That has changed. People are much more interested in this idea now, and I think much more willing to experiment with ways of looking at teaching materials and teaching activities and methodologies from a different perspective, from an ELF-oriented perspective, where we're interested in understanding how speakers communicate, not what language forms they use. And yes, it's very, very challenging to do that because the what teachers typically will respond to me is, well, okay, so what do I teach now? It's not so much what you teach, it's how you raise awareness of the way language is being used communicatively. And I think that's what really matters for teachers and students.
I teach in South Korea, and the
Mm.
students kind of nod along, kind of understanding why ELF is kind of a useful approach or a useful perspective. But then they kind of say, yeah, but what would you say, or what would an American say? They kind of almost default to the native speaker
Right, yes,
norm.
they do. Yes, they do. Which is why a critical awareness of pedagogy is, I think, important. So I think it's worth discussing with those students why it is they are so concerned about how a British person or how an American person would say it. Obviously, you might say it very, very differently from another British teacher or
True,
from
yeah.
an American teacher, right? So, and I think that's useful to make students aware of that native speaker English is also very variable, and people speak in different ways. And the only reason we attach so much importance to it is a historical one. Yeah? It's about how used to assigning particular prestige and status we are to this variety or these varieties, even though they might not be particularly effective in communicative settings. So I mean, one thing I do with the teachers that I work with is look at examples of how miscommunication or breakdown can occur when native speakers are using language. So the key point here is that native speaker English, no matter how much we might assign prestige and value to it, is not necessarily the optimal way to use the language, especially in an intercultural setting where speakers from lots of different first language backgrounds are being asked to use the language.
A lot of students don't even realize that within even a country as small as England, that there's such a variety of languages and the prestige is attached to some and not to others even.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, people tend to think of the UK and the US, for example, as English speaking, and so therefore everyone there speaks English and speaks English in the same way. But of course, the UK and the US are both multilingual environments, particularly if you're in a city like London, where I work, then you're going to hear lots of different languages and lots of different varieties of English in a single day. So I think it's worth raising awareness of that among students. That yes, we tend to have this very monolingual and monolithic approach to language. We are taught to believe that being monolingual is the norm. We're taught to believe that there is a single correct way of using any language in any given setting. And I think it's useful for teachers to adopt a critical perspective on this, and to raise awareness among their students of where these ideas come from in the first place, that they are based on language ideologies, not based on any particular linguistic truths or realities. You know? And that in fact the world is not only very diverse linguistically, but diverse communicatively. So the way we use language is a reflection of the context in which we're speaking. So we will change our language. You do not speak English in the same way in all contexts, and your students do not speak Korean in the same way in all contexts. And I think it doesn't take very much to raise awareness of this diversity in language and language use.
In the interview with Jennifer Jenkins, she said she kind of regretted naming the Lingua Franca core because it suggested a kind of definite approach.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that as a kind of from a classroom perspective?
How do I feel about the term lingua franca core? Or
Yeah, and the idea that some sounds are less important than others, like TH, for example.
I don't think Jennifer Jenkins regrets saying that the TH is less important. Producing a standard native speaker TH form is less important. We know that doesn't impede communication. So I think it's more that she called it a core, and I think that using words like core reinforces this notion that there is a single correct. Well, that wasn't her intention, but it does reinforce that notion. And I know I've marked students' assignments where they've discussed the lingua franca core, and very much approached it, or very much interpreted it as a model when it was never intended as a model. You know? So I think we are so predetermined to think of language in that way that we have to be very, very careful with the way we describe things, which is why at the beginning of our interview I said, not approach, because again that reinforces this notion that there is a single way of doing things and a correct way of doing things. So what people assumed after reading about the lingua franca core in Jennifer Jenkins' early work on phonology was that we were then going to adopt that same perspective in relation to lexis and grammar, and we're going to identify core features of lexis and grammar. And I think that did influence early research in the field, but we've moved on a lot from that, and we are no longer interested in identifying core features as such. What we're interested in doing is identifying typical communicative moves and strategies, showing what people do with language rather than itemizing language and producing a list of core features or core forms. So I think it's important to try to encourage teachers and students to move away from that way of thinking about language. But we have really been preconditioned to think of it in that way.
And I think even most training courses kind of unconsciously put that idea that you are the model.
Oh yeah, very much so. Very much so. Not only that you are the model, but that there can be a single correct model. That there is one way to do things. If you look at the syllabus guidelines for example, CELTA and Delta teaching awards, they very much, both of which refer to English as a lingua franca, but are very much concerned with presenting language as if it were a single set of forms. So it's something. What I found in my own research is that teachers, before they begin their teaching careers, have a fairly monolithic view of language, that they are influenced by what we call standard language ideology, that there should be a single correct way of using language. But in fact, during their teacher training, these ideas become reinforced. I've conducted questionnaire surveys, I've conducted observations and interviews with teachers on pre-service and in-service teacher training courses. And what I've found when I've tried to speak to teachers about what they feel is important to focus on in the classroom and what they feel it is important for teachers to know about language, the answer I get is very often oriented very strongly towards correct usage, and notions of what is grammatical and what is ungrammatical. And very, very few people talk about how important it is to help learners communicate in English. So we begin as teachers with this idea because I think society broadly promotes this idea about language, often consciously, but as you say, also often unconsciously. Yeah? But during the teacher training, instead of having that critiqued, it becomes reinforced. When I, for example, one of the tasks that I do with students at both undergraduate and postgraduate level is ask them to look at examples of English language in use, and then I ask them to comment on that language in use without prompting in any way. I don't ask whether it's correct or incorrect or whether it's effective or ineffective. I simply ask them to comment on these language forms. And what I find is a very strong tendency among the postgraduate students who are all teachers of English, because it is an MA in applied linguistics. Yeah? What I find is a very strong tendency among them to orient towards notions of correctness when they look at language, and more so than the students on the undergraduate programs who have not got any teaching experience or teaching qualification. So we're going. So teacher education is going in the wrong direction. If you know, we need to really rethink teacher education. Not all of it, not all teacher education, right? But a good deal of it, in my experience. Yeah.
Because, as you said, ELF is a perspective, not an approach. Is there such a thing as ELF material?
Not yet. Not yet. Not to my mind. No. There are materials that claim to be adopting a global English's approach or perspective. But very often I've found when looking at this material is that the global English is only there as a topic heading. That there is a lot of talk about language variety and a lot of talk about variation in English, but all of the language practice activities are oriented towards producing British English standard forms. So we are yet to have materials that are really produced from an ELF perspective. But I think it's only a matter of time before we do manage to get more materials, even if those materials are not explicitly promoted as ELF materials. They might be more compatible with an ELF perspective if they focus a lot more on pragmatics. If we have textbooks that have a focus on pragmatics and communicative skills rather than language forms and practicing and rehearsing language forms, then that would be much more compatible with an ELF perspective on language.
Okay. Except for the idea that, for example, that the Lingua Franca core is an approach or a fixed set of standards, are there any other misconceptions about ELF with teachers or students?
Yes, there are. I mean, this is a debate that's been well rehearsed. We've talked a lot about this in the literature in ELF, about misconceptions. And one misconception, well, there are two primary misconceptions. One is that we are saying that we should be teaching a reduced form of English, so a simplified form of English, and that ELF doesn't allow for shades of meaning and nuances of meaning to be communicated because it is just a simplified code. Yeah, that's a misconception. The other misconception is that people researching ELF are saying that anything is okay, anything is acceptable. We don't need to worry about what do we present to students in the classroom or how we approach language in the classroom, because we're not interested in correcting language. Okay, now we might not be interested in correcting language in the conventional sense of the word. We might be more interested in language reformulation. Yeah, and it might not be reformulating language according to a standard form, but no researchers in ELF are saying that in terms of language pedagogy, anything goes, anything is acceptable. No, quite the contrary. We're interested in looking at how language is used to communicate meaning. yeah, and how language is used to maintain relationships and intelligibility. Now, that requires a very different way of thinking about language, but it doesn't mean that we're not interested in presenting students with language activities and reformulating rather than correcting their language use.
Where do you think that misconception or those misconceptions come from?
I think partly they come from our existing beliefs. So because because adopting an elf perspective requires a very different way of thinking about language, it doesn't fit in with our conventional ways of orienting to language in the classroom. So it conflicts with what we have been told is true. So we learn to believe as language teachers that grammar is a precondition for communication. That if you don't speak English with the correct forms, then the chances are you're going to be misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
And the research simply does not support that. We know that that's not the case. That you can speak in a very non-standard way and still be very communicative, and in fact more communicative. You can communicate meaning better sometimes by not using standard forms, by not, for example, using established native speaker idioms, if
Right.
these are semantically opaque and if these are culturally very specific.
Yeah, it's
So
strange because I'm sure a lot of students have actually had that experience where they know that what they're saying isn't 100% quote unquote correct, but that meaning has been understood.
yeah, so it's a question of making teachers and students more aware of how often that happens.
So it's still relatively early days when it
It's
comes
still
to.
relatively early days. Yeah, I mean, I've been critical of this partly because what we've said in the past, what we've tended to say is, ELF research has lots of implications for language pedagogy, and then we've stopped there, and said, right, well, it's up to teachers to know what to do with this. I I think we need to rethink that, and that's what I'm trying to do at the moment with my work. Is working together with teachers, think about how materials might be adapted, how activities and methods that we use might be adapted in order to be more compatible with an ELF orientation on language.
All right, and on that note, let's leave
Okay.
it there. So, Martin Dewey, thank you very much.
You are very welcome. You're very welcome.